Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all, and thank you so much for so many attendees this morning. So welcome to the session on exploring social insights on carbon footprint reduction and sustainability. The session today will last 45 minutes. I'm going to ensure that you get a chance to ask questions, all posted online at the end of the session. If we don't get to all of your questions, don't worry, we'll send you answers as follow-ups, along with the recording, the deck, and also a brief summary of the key insights from today. So I'll be speaking with Sana, who's a research manager of social insights at Metrics Lab, Gilbert, who's our global head of social insights at Metrics Lab as well. So in this session, you can learn more about the voice of the consumer around carbon footprint reduction and sustainability. We've leveraged user-generated content from multiple online platforms to inspire insights for your communication or creatives. And we hope that you'll leave the session today with some inspiration and direction in the area of online sustainability communications. Carbon emissions are rightly a hot topic these days. After the Paris Agreement, more and more countries are committed to reducing their emissions and taking measures to protect the environment. In August this year, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. The IRA marks a radical shift in US climate action, sending a signal that the world's largest historical emitter is now seeking further change. It has a climate commitment to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. Then, ahead of COP26 in November 21, China officially submitted its carbon neutral before 2060 target, strengthening its previous non-fossil share of carbon intensity targets, whilst adding a new renewable energy capacity target as well. We're seeing more and more governments and companies establishing carbon neutrality or reduction targets. And the call to action for brands, of course, is that it's time to keep assessing our own manufacturing processes, as many have done already, of course, continue the pathway to reducing carbon emissions, and importantly, informing our consumers about it. So in the last decade, consumers' interest around sustainability and environmental protection has been growing fast. Scientific reports, significant weather change, increased available information, and the impact of human activity has further raised this awareness. To address climate change, governments, consumers, and companies must work together, committing to adopt more sustainable consumption and production methods to provide further choice for a sustainable lifestyle. We see consumers already starting to make those changes. Actions to protecting the environment and embracing more ecological habits are being incorporated into their everyday lives. Backed by numerous studies that we've seen, we see 73% of consumers saying they would change their consumption habits to reduce their impact on the environment, with over 2/3 of global consumers claiming they are doing all they can to protect the environment. We must, of course, though, as researchers, recognize a degree of social desirability bias in some of these responses, but nonetheless. This increased consumer interest is also reflected in the search behavior of consumers. So we can see here that events like climate change conferences, environmental disasters, and commitments from companies seem to spark even more interest online. Consumers search for more topics like carbon footprint and carbon neutral after events like the Glasgow Summit or commitment for companies for reductions, for example. Those changing search behaviors are clearly linked to key environmentally linked events, providing a useful insight for the timing of any activity to be considered. Let's put it into perspective though. If we look at user-generated content about carbon emissions, the volume of conversations is even higher than personal care and beauty. So those are things like makeup conversations. But staggeringly, it's almost as big as fashion as well, as you can see here. clearly showing the rising importance of this topic. So let's explore a little further. I'm going to hand over to Gilbert now to deep dive into some of the insights.
Thank you, John. And because this is such a vital topic, Metrics Lab wants to explore it further. We're exploring carbon emission and sustainability by listening to the spontaneous and uncensored voice of the consumers. We collected and analyzed all user-generated content about this theme in the past 2 years. So user-generated content is all publicly available conversations, photos, videos around this theme. We're focused on the English language, but the posts are worldwide. Just real quick, a little bit of methodology, but to gather online user-generated content, we use a search strategy. This search strategy is an iterative process. We try a combination of search terms to see if it delivers the right result. We keep on trying the terms until it gives us the most relevant results. Using a combination of tools, we collect anything that's publicly available, covering any type of source, social media platforms, review sites, blogs, forums, and so forth. And after the collection, we analyze the conversations in two ways, starting with the digital landscape. For the digital landscape, we use AI modeling to cluster the conversations. And this helps us to get a better understanding of the topics that people talk about. And this has the benefits that it is quick, but it doesn't always give us the level of granularity. So that's why in the deep dive, we analyzed the data using human enrichment. This is similar to coding open-ends. And with this method, we can go into the granular and actionable insights. So let's dive into the insights. So starting with where do people talk? Knowing where people talk about this theme could help to target your message on specific locations. So where do they talk about carbon emission and sustainability? Most of the conversations take place on social media channels like Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is the leading platform, especially for brands who initiate dialogue on this channel with people. YouTube and Twitter are also important channels, although on these platforms, consumers react more spontaneously and they take the lead, opening a discussion around a sustainability topic. YouTube is the social media channel hosting long videos, which is sometimes necessary to share more detailed information about your initiative. So the punchline is, if your message requires low involvement, like brand messaging, or introducing new products, then you could consider channels like Instagram and Facebook. But if your goal is to changing behavior, then YouTube seems to be more fitting because it allows to elaborate messages. So moving to the digital landscape, in the digital landscape, we leverage AI to cluster all the conversations about carbon emission and sustainability. This is an overview of the different topics that people talk about. The size of the bubble shows how big a topic is. And the closer they are, the stronger they will be related. We also scaled the topics on a vertical and a horizontal axis for easier interpretation. These topics, they range from very small, like eco-friendly initiatives in building and construction, to very large topics like brand initiatives. Personal carbon footprint is the topic that stands out in terms of volume, followed by brand initiatives. And both of these topics, they complement each other. Because brand initiatives, they stimulate consumers to make changes in their consumption habits, and people discuss their initiatives and their own actions. Conversations about actions from consumers, but also actions from companies, are very closely related to each other. For example, consumers demand companies to take action when it comes to emission reduction. At the same time, companies also need people to be engaged with their actions for it to work or get the acceptance. But leveraging human enrichment, we also investigated how consumers perceive terms related to carbon emission. We used human enrichment because the sentiment is more accurate than AI predictions. And in this graph, we can see the different terms ordered by share of positivity. And the green represents the positive sentiment, gray is neutral, and orange is negative. A couple of things that I want to point out. Carbon footprint is the most used term and has 66% positivity. But on top of the graph, we can see that terms like carbon reduction and carbon negative, they spark more positivity. At the bottom of the graph, we see saving the planet, a non-specific and broad concept. It attracts more negativity. And this is usually related to greenwashing. Carbon labeling and carbon offsetting are also common terms, and we will deep dive on those topics later. But in the digital landscape, we see that consumers, they talk a lot about their individual actions to reduce carbon footprint. And this behavior is mainly driven by knowing that they will make a positive impact on the environment and feeling that it is their own individual responsibility. We also had a look at the barriers. So what is holding people back to take action to reduce carbon emission? Well, in the first place, consumers think that their own personal actions are too small to actually move the needle. And these opinions, they come from skeptic consumers, mainly male, who are also very vocal about the lack of credibility of initiatives proposed to reduce emissions. This is often perceived as greenwashing. To a lesser extent, brands are pointed out as part of the problem, pointing out that they're not taking enough responsibility and that there is a lack in their transparency of their activities. The company's effort to share more information is seen by this group as a marketing strategy or marketing ploy. And a final interesting note is that these consumers, they don't look at the carbon labels if they buy products, since they have doubts about the calculation and the trustworthiness of the information. And really, one final note is that price was not mentioned as one of the barriers to reduce carbon emission. So one thing that I really want to point out is that when it comes to the barriers, there are fundamental differences between sectors. So we really have to customize our communication strategies depending on the different sectors. For example, greenwashing is mainly an important barrier when it comes to beauty and personal care, not so much in the transportation industry. In the food and beverage category, a lot of people are held back because they don't believe their actions will make a difference. There are also key difference in the attitude between groups, and Sana will tell you more about this.
Yes, thank you, Gilbert. Now let me tell you more about the target audience and the different attitudes that we have discovered when it comes to the carbon footprint debate. Even though younger generations are more active online discussing about the carbon footprint, the urgency of the topic is spread amongst all age groups. Recent studies show that in terms of age, older consumers are only a bit behind in terms of engagement, although the interest is on par with younger consumers. Looking at the sentiment distribution in this study, older consumers are as positive as the younger ones. And therefore, when communicating to potential customers, brands should target all age groups. Older generations cannot be overlooked, since a large portion of the audience who is already interested in the topic will then be dismissed. In terms of involvement, we can already observe changes in behavior in reaction to carbon footprint. Consumers have understood that their actions are contributing to reducing emissions, and they are making conscious choices when it comes to more sustainable purchases and consumption. Buying more sustainable products is one of these choices, and consumers go for products with raw materials that are sustainably sourced, but also with packaging in which limited amounts or no plastic is used. And in terms of food consumption, environmentally concerned consumers are changing their diet by reducing their meat intake, as they understand the impact of the meat industry on carbon emissions. We found that consumers are actively taking actions already to reduce their personal carbon footprint, and these consumers can be typified as improvers. This is the largest group vocal online, sharing their experiences with reducing their carbon footprint, and in that process they sometimes also refer to scientific sources. And this group is most aware of carbon labeling and also cares most about the topic. However, there are also consumers vocal online with a less positive attitude in the carbon footprint debate. Doubters might care about the carbon footprint, but there's a lower awareness of carbon labels. They do have an intention to act in favor of the environment, but a lack of understanding what is meant with carbon footprint and labels leads to questioning the information. Then non-believers are the most negative and skeptical group of all. They do not care about their carbon footprint or they deny climate change in general. And this group is aware of carbon labels, but when noticed, these are considered misleading and that could cause mistrust towards the company using them. Then there is a group of consumers that is just not committed. They do not care about their carbon footprint and they are poorly informed and not aware of carbon labels. And there's a low likelihood that labels have any effect or are even noticed. So this group really needs other cues to change attitudes and behavior. What doubters and non-believers have in common is that there is a need for information. Doubters ask questions about how the carbon footprint is calculated or how useful carbon labels will be, which is indicating that there is an opening for marketeers to educate this group. The communication targeting non-believers is more challenging for brands. These consumers are very resistant to the topic and they tend to refute any argument proposed by brands and companies. So establishing trust by communicating to them via an organization or influencers that they associate themselves with can be effective to catch their attention and try to convince them. So educating doubters, building trust amongst non-believers, and reinforcing the good intentions that improvers already have is key in the reduction of carbon footprints. Consumers do feel that brands should do more and take the lead towards carbon reduction, as they understand that production and transportation are key contributors to carbon emission. Playing the sustainability card with carbon labels is not enough. Consumers need companies to share information on their processes and solutions to reduce emissions in a transparent way. This is a focal point to consider for every marketer involved in communication around sustainability and emission reductions. And with that being said, I would like to hand it over back to Gilbert.
Thank you, Sonna. So, as mentioned in the beginning, carbon labeling and carbon offsetting are often mentioned terms, and consumers see this as a way to help reduce, compensate their carbon footprint. Overall perception is positive towards labels and offsetting, but what stands out in these conversations is that they really want brands to go further with the reduction of their own emission and communicate with honesty how their efforts are contributing to protect the environment. So when it comes to the labels, people are very positive about it. 61% is positive, because they really see it as a good way or a good tool to reduce carbon emission. Especially women are convinced of this. On the other side, we also found some skepticism. So some consumers do not believe in the calculation or the good intention of companies. Especially among men, there is the underlying perception of the carbon labeling as the new marketing gimmick to improve the brand's reputation instead of actually making a change. And by listening to the spontaneous voice of the consumers, you also get very actionable feedback about the needs when it comes to carbon labels. For example, users demand cohesiveness in the labels. The diversity on labeling makes it hard for consumers to make decisions or to decide which information is reliable or not. So they really want those labels to be accurate and comparable. According to consumers, the labels are also not often comparable. So people also mention that it doesn't, as a result, it doesn't help them to make decisions about which products to buy or which products not to buy. There are also some mentions of people that would like to see a simplified color code, just like some nutrition labels. But color coding also has some downsides. So we also did a social insights study on the nutrition label called the Nutri-Score. And even though people mention that it is really helpful in making decisions about which products to buy, they also question the trustworthiness of the score and thus also question the colors. One final note on labels. In Europe, they're also already working on implementation of the legislation on the eco design for sustainable products. So carbon information would ideally be available in a digital passport that will store all relevant information throughout the product's life cycle. Outside Europe, third-party organizations are taking the lead, like Carbon Trust, which started in the UK and it's gaining popularity. China is not considering a label system at this moment. Carbon offsetting is also positively perceived, and consumers believe that it makes measurable difference. In online conversations, consumers talk about their favorite offsetting program and explain how easy they are to use. Again, we also see some negative reactions to carbon offsetting. In these reactions, consumers state that they don't believe that it is a solution to reduce carbon emissions, but rather something to buy off your guilt. Some people feel that individually they cannot make a change or their contribution doesn't help that much. Companies in this could really take the lead in carbon offsetting by making this process and efforts as transparent as possible. Again, there are some suggestions from consumers to improve on this. For example, programs should use understandable calculations of the footprint, or companies should choose an offsetting program that is credible and trustworthy. For example, one that is gold standard certified. So we talked a lot about the diagnostics, but let's go to John to hear about a recap of what kind of marketing and communication implication this study has.
Great. Thanks, Gilbert. So there's a lot of depth that we've got here into the study. We obviously can't share everything today, but please, do ask your questions throughout and follow up with us afterwards as well. But let's just try to wrap up what those key takeouts have been from what we found so far. So it's clear, isn't it, really, to all that the urgency of carbon reduction is real. The majority of consumers expect action and are taking some action themselves as well. And we see interest in sustainability and our carbon footprint increasing exponentially in recent years. The number of conversations, as we saw in this topic, was comparable to that to fashion, larger than all online conversations about personal care and beauty. And interestingly, when we looked at this compared to a year earlier, the number of raw conversations on carbon emissions had increased year on year by 38%. So an amazing increase year on year, which a trend we're sure we're going to see continuing. Most conversations come from consumers discussing their individual footprint and notable brand initiatives as well that they've taken note of and seen to reduce emissions. More than 88% of those discussions take place on social media in general, whilst we only see about 8% happening on forums. So online consumers can be clearly classified, as Sana showed. according to their attitudes on the subject. It's a very simple way of classifying them, well, not some complex algorithm. But improvers, the largest group, have already made those changes in their daily lives and are open to further reducing their emissions. We saw the doubters that have good intentions but have doubts about the validity of carbon footprint and labels, and those non-believers who are skeptical about CO2 emissions and climate change in general, and are resistant to really most initiatives. And then finally, the smallest group, those non-committed who just don't care about carbon footprint and are poorly informed or unaware of carbon labels, really. For this group, of course, there's little chance that labels will have any effect or any communications really as well. So labels certainly won't be noticed with this group. We saw also that all age groups are committed to reducing their carbon footprint, but there is a slight tendency we saw there identified with men being considerably more skeptical than women, so something to consider in our communications. Being part of the solution and the proven effectiveness of the measures taken, they are the main drivers to reducing emissions. So it's about feeling involved and feeling part of that solution. And also, to reiterate the point about proven effectiveness so that those measures really have some solid background to them. There are already visible behavioral changes that consumers have made amongst all age groups, such as buying more environmentally friendly products, dieting, or choosing sustainable travel. We see recycling, buying locally, and reducing consumption were mentioned in those behavioral conversations, but to a slightly lesser extent. Key to note that participation in lowering carbon emissions is visible across all age groups, so implications for our targeting. Consumers are already changing their consumption patterns on a large scale to be more environmentally friendly. We see that they increasingly feel that it's their individual responsibility to reduce their carbon emissions and are trying to make a change with their actions. We see the most frequently mentioned barriers come from consumers who think that their own actions will not make a difference. Skepticism is also driven by lack of credibility of the initiatives that are proposed or of what they see, and that's often seen as greenwashing, as we know. Brands are identified as part of the problem as well, citing a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency in their operations to those who mentioned it. Okay, so let's turn to a brief summary on carbon labeling then from what we've uncovered. So both carbon labels we've shown and offsetting are seen by most consumers as positive initiatives to reduce carbon emissions. Opponents of those labels, they do see them as a marketing gimmick that capitalize on brand reputation rather than helping consumers. But with regard to carbon offsetting, supporters really praise the results achieved with these programs and the opportunities to really see those investments making a difference. That's again vital to that point back to transparency we talked about earlier. So any lack of transparency and information, they tend to be those biggest drivers of negativity. And critics see those programs more and more, if there isn't enough transparency and information, as greenwashing, of course, and not the real solution. So be transparent about the calculations by showing them from sourcing to production to waste, that's all been considered, and use those internationally recognized standards that Gilbert showed us earlier. Consumer conversations indicate very clearly that consumers want accurate and cohesive information on labeling. They want comparability between labels and easy to understand classification, which are really key to supporting that consumer purchase journey. Also, consistency of information across products or services would be ideal. We recognize that's a challenge, particularly until government ruling comes in on labeling, but we suspect that won't be too long. Although, as you can imagine, that's a very complex and difficult situation that's been tried before. Simplicity in design, vital for any design anyway, obviously, but consider really here how much information is already on packs, of course, or under our services when we're putting that information out. So it raises the question, are consumers really ready and able to calculate their own footprint? Is the amount of CO2 for each product a step too far at the moment, potentially? We'd argue probably it is at this stage in evolution, really, of where consumer attitudes and behaviours are. We'd suggest maybe considering phasing it in with a colour scheme initially, and think about things like Nutri-Score, example that Gilbert just showed us, and also energy efficiency labels that are fairly universal for electrical items across the EU. We can share those examples for our international colleagues. So offsetting carbon emissions for your brands with a reliable, recognized and transparent offsetting program would really help consumers. Some ideas around using scannable labels on your packaging or your service information, for example, or links on your website that direct consumers to the site of your trusted carbon offset partner would really help guide our busy consumers. And critically as well, selecting an offsetting company accredited by the gold standard. Again, we can share more information on that if you need, that has multiple types of compensation projects in different regions and can show where consumers' individual contribution has made a real difference. However, a really key point is an over-reliance on offsetting is not necessarily advised here. It comes back to the point about getting our fundamentals right in the first place through reducing manufacturing emissions to give offsetting much more credibility and reinforcement. Okay, let's move on to our recommendations then. So first of all, key is, of course, is to continue supporting driving awareness of the issues as brand owners, of course, so stimulating that education and awareness throughout the activities that we do around carbon footprint. Maybe the use of dedicated posts on brands' social channels would help pave the way for the introduction of carbon labelling and offsetting initiatives if they're not communicated already. And as I touched on earlier, getting our fundamentals right really here. So consumers really expect us now and actually increasingly demand to manufacturers to have your house in order, really, I suppose, if you like, before you communicate in this space. Without supporting credibility of sustainable production and efforts towards ESG with very clear strategies on ESG as a business, other communications, particularly carbon labeling, will be fraught with greenwashing and concerns, and objections. So, of course, continuously conducting environmental reviews of our activities, as many are doing already, setting those targets for improvement, continuously monitoring them and implementing action plans to reduce our emissions, and considering those offsetting programs, which if not already in place, of course, to consumers that really are fundamentally reliable, transparent and easy to use. And when we talk about easy to use, this is about giving transparency to consumers. Again, this if we can make them feel empowered by showing them the kind of information and the impact that their purchases are having directly on carbon reduction, and that's really going to support our purchase journeys for consumers and make them feel empowered around that they can really make a difference here. So finally, on this point, also have clear and brand linked ESG strategies, of course. So, if your brand lives its ESG values, then it will resonate more with consumers, of course. It's a vital point. Tailoring then your online media plan for sustainability. So consider your weight. Gilbert showed some interesting insights there around the amount of activities and search on social media. It has implications, of course, for maybe prioritizing Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for those shorter brand messages. whereas maybe YouTube should be used for more discursive or informative type communications as well to help support our initiatives here. Influencers, as we know, have a huge influence, albeit declining in many areas, in this space for online conversations, but we've got to be very careful in this area with influencers, of course. Too strong a commercial ties can actually be harmful and can actually backfire. So in terms of targeting strategy, reconsider what we've been thinking in the past. Age does not discriminate on this topic anymore, despite the myths. Keep it broad, target all age groups with the messaging across this area, and consider here that males have a slight tendency to be less supportive of issues surrounding carbon footprint. And maybe prioritize those improvers by reinforcing their good intentions, but try to educate doubters and build trust amongst those non-believers that we've identified. We can really easily help you identify those as well. Also, reappraising the content of your communications. So getting our fundamentals right will increasingly become expected as a hygiene factor by consumers. There's no need for this to be central to communications, we'd advocate, but make it publicly accessible, make it easy to access, and really importantly, partner with trusted organizations or individuals to spread the message. All brand content, as all brand content normally, needs to be simple to understand, needs to be relatable to the brand, but importantly here, evidenced in what you are doing to meet those claims. Any visual representation, or association with the implicit nature of the visual, need to be very carefully balanced and supported with evidence. Finally, then, the tonality of communications. So expressions like saving the planet or protecting the environment are more skeptically received than other related items like carbon reduction or carbon negative. Choose words that spark more positivity and empower consumers when they realize their actions can really make a difference. So emphasizing the importance of the synergy between brands' initiatives and consumers' contributions are essential to make your message resonate with consumers. Lastly, then, is a call to action. Consumers want our brands to be accountable for the environmental impact. And of course, together, we can all keep taking the lead in this area. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. If you want to know more about what social insights or sustainability work that we do can help with your brand or category, do get in touch. Now we're going to open the floor to questions, and we have a good 6 or 7 minutes on questions, so we'll go through those. One I think for you, Gilbert, is do we have any social insights capabilities in other languages, so Arabic and Chinese?
Yes, we have. We can cover any country except for Korea. That's still work in progress. But other than that, we cover everything. We cover any language.
Okay, great. So next question, we have one here around, in terms of the groups that we identified, you mentioned the improvers were the largest group and people not committed the smallest, but isn't that related to people not committed who are not that active online about the topic? I think that's probably one for you, Sana, isn't it?
Yeah, that's, I think, a question I can answer. It's a very interesting question indeed. Yeah, we do think that consumers that are not that concerned can be less active online when it comes to the topic. But that also highlights, of course, the necessity of tailoring your communication towards the several attitudes that are out there. And also engage the ones with a more negative attitude, or the ones that are not involved in the topic yet.
Great. Okay, thank you, Sana. Okay, a few more. So One great question here. How do you see the role of carbon credits in a company's sustainability strategy? I'll take that one. So I think for many of you who will know that there's been this increasing trend towards buying carbon credits as part of carbon offsetting. There's actually a huge trade in the area as well. So companies are able to actually buy these carbon credits, and many companies are also actually selling these carbon credits. Tesla are a very good example of that. Actually, Elon Musk very cleverly actually almost financed the early days of Tesla through selling his carbon credits to companies. And I think still nowadays, I think still makes about a third of his profits based on selling carbon credits. Now, of course, these are for companies that want to offset and trade in this area to help offset their carbon emissions. And sometimes there's a bit of cynicism around this area, but actually there's lots of very clear and universal and global authorities that are now set up that regulate this as an industry. And so it is, you know, very well organized and very well regulated. And really just being transparent, I suppose, to consumers about that would also really help in communications if we feel that that's appropriate to start talking about them. So it feels like it's going to be pretty much a future trend that's not going to go away as increasingly it becomes important. Okay. That we are actually so close to time. I'm going to wrap it up. We have a few other questions, but I don't think we'll have time to answer those. But thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance and engagement. You will be followed up. Teams will send you out the recording, the deck, and also a brief summary of what we've covered today. But please do get in touch with us if you've got any other questions or follow-ups, and we appreciate your time and involvement. So thanks very much, everyone.